Alessia, many thanks for this kind introduction. So the title of the panel is The New Digital World. So let me just very quickly frame the topic of this panel discussion and explain why this is important. So at the moment, many traditional companies are fundamentally shifting and changing and transforming their existing organizational structures, which have been designed for the industrial age, into more flexible, more agile structures, more appropriate for the digital economy. Why is this happening? This is happening because the existing organizational structures, which are designed for industrial age, they are more focused on efficiency and less focused on innovation and creativity and agility, entrepreneurship. And those capabilities are becoming more and more important, especially in the digital economy. And we will now discuss in this panel how that works and what makes it, what is relevant and what are the pros and cons of this kind of development. So I'm very much delighted to have such an experienced panel, and let me now jump into the details and into the questions. So Angelika, as you are head of HR of Klöckner, so you are basically in the middle of this development. So what does agility mean to you, and what are the challenges for a very traditional company like Klöckner?
Probably makes sense to explain a little bit what we are doing. We are a steel distribution company, more than 110 years old. So, and when you look around in the world, or also here in the room, everywhere is steel. You see bars, you see steel tubes, you see flat steel. So a world without steel is not possible. That means this industry is still alive and sustainable and sexy. But we have to tremendously change the business model. Because the way to produce a sales margin, the trading margin, is not the same as years before. So we try to digitalize the whole supply chain, started from the front end, and now we are digitalizing it from the back end. We already achieved 26% of online sales. The objective is 60%. And you can imagine that behind that, there's a fundamental change internally is going on. And we have a lot of measures we try to push to have impact. And agility is a word. We try to explain it, and we look at agility to help our workforce to be able to execute, to be able to adapt fast and quick, to be resilient, resilient mindset with a strong core, and last but not least, to increase learning curiosity. This is for us agility.
Tomasz, you have a very international background. You have worked in different roles, in different geographies, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Hong Kong. Now you live in the UK, you work in Germany. So what does culture or geography means for this? Is there a cultural bias in implementing agility?
So you're right. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, China, India, Philippines, then some Middle East and Europe. So I guess it's quite eclectic sort of ecosystems I've seen. And throughout my career, I did a lot of transformation. I've seen a lot of transformation. I was part of a lot of transformation. And from that perspective, as you would expect, each cultural environment brings a different set of challenges, a different set of biases, and different set of sensitivities that one has to be aware of and look for. Last year in this conference, very much talk about the learning agility, which is a very important part of any transformation. I think in addition to that, what I have also discovered across all of those different transformations, different continents, different companies, different industries. I work for 7 different industries. But there's a second beat that actually unites them very much, is the diversity of thought. The need for diversity of thought is absolutely essential in any transformation, and specifically in digital transformation, where we're really automating, digitalizing. We're looking at things from a completely different perspective, from inside out and from outside in the companies. So both together, learning, agility, and diversity of thought really are very important in those transformations, regardless where you are.
So we will come to that topic of diversity of sorts a little bit later. So Alvaro, you are, beside the fact that you are acting as the CEO of BRECA, you have a background in organizational psychology, and you are also a film director. So how does that help you to implement agile structures?
Oh, hello everyone. My name is Alvaro. I come from Peru. I work at Grupo BRECA, which is the largest conglomerate in Peru and in South America. It has like 130 years. It's a very traditional company. It ranges from mining to cement to health to insurance to banking, real estate, fishery, explosives, you can name it. And I just joined the BRECA group 2 years ago to design the innovation hub that I will talk later. But the interesting thing is that I'm an organizational psychologist and I'm a filmmaker. Probably for the film fans that were in Berlinale last year, my film Retablo was competing there, so I don't know if you've seen it. But something that's really interesting is how to decompose agility on the one hand and agile structures on the other. Agility, for me at least, or how I see it, is a muscle. It's a creative muscle that has to be nurtured and has to be developed. How? That's an interesting question that through psychology and organizational psychology, we can bring some answers. On the other hand, agile structures. I think the best example I personally have of agile structures is what happens in a film set. If you think about agile structures are safe platforms, in most of the cases, where you can iterate, you can fail better, fail faster, learn, and then discover something that is waiting to be discovered. How to facilitate those spaces is an interesting question that the film background brings us. Imagine when you're doing a film, you still have a limited budget, right? And you have a deadline. And normally, you have a script that is composed by many scenes, and within each scene, you have a lot of takes, right? And sometimes we have to do a scene in 4 hours. But it's really interesting what happens with the team that's behind doing a movie, which is a collaborative, creative process. From the moment you say action, and from the moment you say cut, all this film crew goes and see what they have done. And of course, the first take always is rubbish, right? So you have to start playing with your actors in a different way and with your crew in a different way to figure out what are you going to do in the next take. And you go through this iterative process until you beautifully find something that works in the scene. Those ingredients that are behind a film set and also in organizational psychology are interesting models that we can bring to the organizational level.
Amy, you are a lecturer at Stanford, and you own a startup, and you have done fundamental research on entrepreneurial success factors. So what tells the research, or tells you the research about, agility and entrepreneurial success?
Yeah, so I am pleased to be here. I teach at Stanford Graduate School of Business. I teach entrepreneurship, both high-scale entrepreneurship, a course called Hacking Entrepreneurship about startups that go 0 to 100 million in revenue, US dollar revenue, with 5 years of history, not more than 10 years to get to that scale. I spent 5 years at Harvard University interviewing the top 200 entrepreneurs in the United States to figure out the skill set they have in common. And I believe there are 6 skills. One of them dovetails, and you can see it in film industry or construction. What we're talking about with that is cognitive diversity and flash teams. You see a lot of entrepreneurs pull together a team for a specific project. It's time delimited, and then it dissolves again. And that's one of these 6 skills that came out of the data set. I have about 10 years of research behind high-scale entrepreneurs. In the last couple years, as you mentioned, I started running a company called Ingenuity, and we are advising large businesses, Fortune 500s, very large legacy businesses, on this same question, which is how can you make talent, how do you make executives more entrepreneurial? And we're developing a micro-learning curriculum, scalable tools, and I think that that is really the next frontier is instead of 2 guys in a garage in Silicon Valley where I live, I really do think it's a guy and a girl, it's a diverse workforce on top of a legacy platform to be an entrepreneur at scale. And so this fall I started teaching a new course at Stanford called Beyond Disruption, and it's really about these very large-scale entrepreneurs bringing in leaders at Amazon and Google and Walmart and Procter & Gamble, Barclays out of London, and asking them what are the skill sets there? So that's a little bit on what I'm looking at.
I think that's a very, very important topic. So almost every company I'm working with is asking for more entrepreneurship in their employee base. So in your research, you discovered, as Thomas already mentioned, you discovered that cognitive diversity is a key leadership skill. Mm-hmm. So what does it really mean, and why is it so important?
So cognitive diversity, I think, is really the diversity we should be talking about. We talk, especially in the United States right now, but I think all over Europe, about diversity on the outside, what we can see: gender, race, socioeconomic difference, age, et cetera. Cognitive diversity is about what goes on inside your brain, inside your mind. And so it's about building on each other's ideas because you're bringing a different point of view. And that is really an important skill for entrepreneurs. It is not obvious based on what you look like. You have to talk to someone for a while. You have to ask a lot of questions. The curiosity point was brought up. You have to really listen. And there are different kinds of cognitive diversity. Someone can be trained as an anthropologist or a computer scientist. You bring a different point of view. You could be an extrovert or an introvert. There's a very different approach to problem solving. You could be a convergent thinker, a divergent thinker. There are lots of different ways that people's brain power is different, and the real entrepreneurial skill is to harness that through on and offline forums. And the research that I've done has talked quite a lot about ways you can use online tools and ways that you can configure space in a real life setting to bring people's ideas forward. So that's cognitive diversity.
So a couple of years ago, we were talking about high-performance teams. So, you know, bringing different talents together and building high-performance teams. So what's the difference?
Well, I think cognitive diversity shows up in high-performance teams. One thing that I think is really different for large corporations, because this is now a conversation that's moving towards these large legacy businesses, is that it's really sometimes hard to get people to talk across silos. I think the big difference here with startups and large corporations, and this is probably the biggest lever of difference that I see, is that startups are very willing to have conflict. They see business as intellectual debate. People come with a point of view. If you think you are out of business in 3 months, you're out of time, you're out of money, your product is failing, there's no problem telling your boss, your employee, your co-founder, we're going the wrong way and we have to stop right now, right? And large corporations, there's too much drive for consensus. You're not running out of time, you're not gonna be out of a job in 3 months, and therefore people don't make decisions quickly, and they don't harness the cognitive diversity. They wait for everyone in order to drive forward, and that is really fundamentally different.
So if I may add to this. So, as I said, on many continents, many industries, different corporations, and I find exactly the same experience. We forget that we originally are very much silo-driven companies. Mm. And when we are silo-driven companies, our diversity of thought doesn't exist, because if we're all accountants, we are one shape or form, think similarly. If we're all IT folks, we're all engineers. So and then you got the more other side of the brain, people, sales, marketing, they think differently. And suddenly when you did it in the past, you bring them all together, something doesn't work, because they're almost like those guys, we don't understand each other, yeah? And then over time, you start working more and more together. And what you recognize is this is, as Amy mentioned before, it's nothing to do with the necessary gender or age or ethnicity. It has to do with came from a different backgrounds. And even in the companies, we talk quite often is that because we don't get people through the companies, if we don't have enough new recruits,
Das heißt, wir gehen alle auf die Bühne, setzen uns hin, dann mache ich nochmal eine kurze Anmoderation, dann geht's los.
The blood doesn't flow through the company because there's new ideas. I actually think we should start thinking about it slightly differently. I think we should still bring a lot of new people because they think differently and they're not part of sort of the ecosystem within, which thinks similarly, but also start thinking how the companies within themselves think differently and work together differently to actually bring it all up. Because, again, I completely agree with Amy that what I have noticed, doesn't matter which continent, doesn't matter which industry, if the company is very large, they try to harmonize themselves. The consensus they're looking for kills completely not just the agility, entrepreneurship. I've seen this many times. And when I did my study in Australia, in the School of Entrepreneurship, it's exactly what we discussed. If there is no conflict, then nothing happens because people don't exchange ideas. And English is actually quite, I blame the language for it, because in English language, conflict is a very negative way of looking at things, whereas we should start looking at conflict as a very positive thing, because it unleashes the entrepreneurial juices, and we should encourage discussion rather than kill it and try to harmonize everything.
So when we had the prep discussion for that panel, Tomasz, you raised that question of did this concept really left the academic debate? So are you guys using this concept already? So you, Tomasz, or Angelika, or Alvaro, in your traditional companies?
Very much so. I mean, if you ask anyone working for the companies I work for, I'll be the guy who asks all the fundamental questions. Sometimes stupid questions, I guess, but they're fundamental questions. Why are we doing this way? You didn't answer my questions. Why are we doing this way? And again...
And asking 4 or 5 times the why, that's what we teach our people.
It's exactly the point.
Why?
Yeah?
Why? Exactly.
Exactly the point. So I think from my perspective, I have been actually doing what I preach. Yeah? And I think for the last at least 15, 20 years, I found that it is very difficult to actually spark those discussions. But once they start going, it gets only better and better, because if you set up the right environment, and then you take under consideration the cultural sensitivity that come with it, then you can advance any strategy, any implementation in a quite good way.
I think there are 2 issues. So if you have a startup, that's another situation. We also have a corporate startup, our Klöckner.ai in Berlin, where they develop the digitalization at the front end to the customer, and we have the Xing materials where we have the open platform. But internally, we have to change the corporate DNA. And the typical corporate DNA in steel distribution is conservative, passive, hierarchical, not curious, but with a fundamental steel knowledge, which you cannot easily buy on the market. So this is good. But you have to change the way how we are working. So when you say silos, we all know it from companies. What we did really, we changed the whole communication. So we canceled all communication formats, and we have one channel. It's Yammer. It's a Microsoft solution, but you can use other tools. But the way how we are using it, we have now 65% on Yammer, and all communication is going over this channel. So, and that helps to accelerate the organization to talk to each other and show also where our mistakes happen. So we talk about the web shop, but internally we have a fax for a voucher and put it manually into the PC. These are then the back-end digitalization which have to be done. And another issue I would like to raise up, we often hear in companies, we have to take all our employees with us. We have to motivate all our people. And I don't think, we have to be very honest to your people. We say we don't take all of you with us, but we give you offers. We help to enable yourself. We have a digital academy where we increase the digital skills of the people, but you have to go your way alone. So the self-organization of the people is becoming crucial, I think. And this is where startups are really a step ahead, but not a corporate world. And this has to be fostered.
I think you were touching a very important point. So it's all about changing the DNA of a corporation or a company. So that's probably the most difficult thing to do. So Alvaro, any perspective on that one? How are you doing it? So how do you make it work?
Very good. It's a really, really interesting question. I think there is a responsibility for organizations to see how they're going to design their teams. The first thing they have to answer is, how do you want to design your team? And I totally agree with what Amy said. I mean, you firstly have to understand not only, you want to orchestrate diversity, so you want to understand gender, sex orientation, age, but also if they are introverts, extroverts, if they are implementers or they are creative. So you have to know who do you want to put in that team. And you want to make that team has to be different. And then you have to help them be a social lubricant, because they have to make things happen. How are we doing it right now? We have done an initiative called Brain Academy, which is a parallel and safe process outside the organization, and where there's a program that's through analytics, through human-centered design, through technology, through digital transformation. There's a lot of challenges, but they not necessarily are challenges of the business. They're relatable. So people firstly go there and try things out, because when they try projects that are not theirs, they're more free. And for us, we have a team of psychologists that are studying who is good at what. Of course, most of them are good with their skills, but not necessarily relating with the other, challenging the other, reading subtext, gluing the persons, pushing the person. So we have to scout who these people are inside the organization, firstly. Those metrics of high potential do not work here, because we are looking for people that has to embrace ambiguity, has to embrace uncertainty, because that's what you're doing in these spaces, right? And there are not many. So the first thing we have to do is to find these people, and then create the spaces where they can feel free, and they have to feel that they are not afraid of making mistakes. And you have to protect that. Initially, when we started our hub, and this is actually funny, because they asked me, what's going to be the name of the hub? And I said, Uterus 27. And why 27? Because it was a postal code of Lima. But why uterus? Because ideas were killed every 5 minutes. And if you don't create a uterus, metaphorically speaking, inside a traditional company, how ideas are going to emerge? How are you going? Normally, ideas are fragile. Everybody's afraid of what people are going to think, right? So you need to create a space, a transitional space, in which these things can emerge. Somebody that's doing, an organization that's doing this very well, is Cirque du Soleil. They, for instance, apart from all the things that they do, in 2013, 14, and 15, well, they acquired a nightclub called Light in Las Vegas. And of course, what happens in Light is just a nightclub of electronic music, Wednesday, Thursday, Fridays, and Saturdays, from 10 o'clock to 5 in the morning, right? But the interesting thing, I remember my first day there was, arrive there at 8 in the morning, right? And I said, at 8 in the morning? What's going to happen at 8 in the morning? And you find all the artists there, and all the people from the cast and crew. And at 9 in the morning, and they were doing their exercises, right? They were, cooling off, until at 9 in the morning, the artistic director arrives and says, the theme for tonight will be surprise. So now you have 10 hours to create a performance, not only technically, but creatively, about surprise. And they will do it, and they will have to perform it in the evening. The interesting thing of Cirque du Soleil is that the next day they have to change the topic. And the policy is that you can never do the same production. If not, you're out. So what happens, of course, you're in the nightclub, and most of the people are drunk, right, having a nice time. And of course, they are trying things out. And there is a team that actually is scouting and looking what is working and what is not, so they can put out in the market. No? So this is an example of a transitional safe space in which you can try things out. No? That's an interesting model.
So that's quite an interesting model, so what we can learn from that area. So Amy, what can we learn from startups so to implement those kind of structures?
So I can pick up on that point. Startups are failing all the time. Some of the greatest entrepreneurs, Elon Musk, arguably one of the greatest entrepreneurs of our time, is failing spectacularly all the time. And we're seeing it when rockets blow up and things like that. So the failure point or the risk tolerance is really an important thing for large companies to try to change. And I'll give one example. You can set a failure ratio. You can actually say 1 in 3 things we try won't work. That's what we want. 1 in 5 things, 1 in 10 things. You just don't want a 0 ratio here, right? So if you have a perfect record, and many corporations are looking for perfect records, perfect quarterly numbers, hitting certain metrics or targets, taking risk out of a system, that's traditional way of managing international growth business. If you flip it around and say, no, I actually want to get it wrong, and my team is going to get it wrong, a certain percentage of the time, you build in the failure. And so that is a really good way to test incremental experiments and avoid catastrophic mistakes. So that's one thing that I think entrepreneurs do pretty well. They come up short all the time. Those teams change. I mean, there's lots of different words for it. Pivot is one that we're talking about. Experiment is one that we're talking about. Risk tolerance, placing small bets. There's a lot of different ways this gets talked about in Silicon Valley and beyond. But I think a ratio is a really good way to think about it, especially for larger corporations.
So in our research, when implementing those agile entrepreneurial structures, cognitive diversities, and those kind of things, in our research, the lack of leadership is one of the, I would say, biggest barrier for implementation. So how does that resonate? So how do you guys deal with this? Who wants to go first?
Leadership. So what is leadership? I guess that's the first question pops to my mind, yeah? What was leadership 20 years ago? What was 10 years ago? What is today? And what is in 10 years could be completely different things, yeah? I know it's a very philosophical statement, but I think what I've seen over just the last 20 years that I've seen now, there are a different set of skills, capabilities, characteristics of a discussion that are happening.
But our leadership skills, which are currently in place, are they able or are they allowing diversity of thoughts? Are they allowing entrepreneurship? Are they supporting this, or do we need to change something here?
So in my experience, you really need to increase the learning agility, and then your diversity of thought is part of your learning agility. From my personal perspective, you see, when you walk into a meeting of 20 people and everyone nods heads, there is something wrong with the meeting, yeah? Because that means they just all came together without any commitment just to have an administrative discussion that doesn't really move anything forward. And I've seen this in companies which require large change. So that doesn't happen in a startup company, in my experience. Yeah, they actually come. They really brainstorm the stuff. Yeah, whereas when we in large corporations, you have to push it. There's no doubt. So it's interesting. I was just looking at the theme of this year's conference. Yeah, courage. This is about courage. Leadership these days is about courage. It is about bringing something completely different and not be afraid to bring it. Yeah? And therefore, the leaders need to create environments, from my perspective these days, to achieve the learning agility. And at the same time, release the diversity of thinking. Yeah? So the leader's task today is to have courage to actually still push this, encourage it, and don't give up. So the resilience is still very, very important in the leadership. And I've seen a lot of corporations, a lot of middle managers, this is where the toughest part, from my perspective, sits, don't have that. Yeah? Because if somehow in their DNA, it is not about doing that. It's not about challenging itself, but just filling 5 boxes every day.
Angelika, are you working with your leaders on that? Are you training them?
We do a lot of training, but I think you have also this ambiguity principle. So on the one hand, you have to foster your standard business, you have to lead your standard business, and on the other hand, you have to enable the people to think some steps ahead. And therefore, you need other qualities. The dialogue, the ability for a dialogue is really increased in the last years. Listening with 2 big ears and really foster a dialogue with a person and to give people the space also to accompany. So we try, just to make it more pragmatic, we try to foster it in several issues. We have an emerging leaders program, and years before, the CEO of a country decides who goes there. And now the people can apply. And since the people are able to apply, we have 200% more applications. But the people have to think alone, do I think I'm able to apply for that program? The same is with, we have an innovation team, and therefore we have a value accelerator, and the people can, beside their business, apply for joining these projects, no? Because they bring into their knowledge, and therefore you need leaders who understand the chance of that. And this dialogue we quite often have internally.
So as we are coming to the end of that panel discussion, so what would be one advice you would give companies who are at the point of transforming their organization into an agile organization? So what would be one advice?
So I'll jump in there. I think you have to learn. To the question before, even on leadership and how is it shifting, I think in the past people thought you could be an expert, you could get really good and have an expertise. The world is shifting and changing so quickly that you have to be ready to learn every single day. And I'll give an example. So the remaking of Microsoft that we're seeing right now as a very large legacy business is pretty fascinating. And the new CEO, Satya, has said, we're not going to be a know-it-all culture, we're going to be a learn-it-all culture. And that is actively shifting, and you can see, I believe, a very large company become more entrepreneurial by learning. So I think that's the big thing.
Thomas, anything to add?
So I completely agree with Emmy, and what I would just add to it is that in that learning exercise, we have to remember that the way people will look at problems might be completely different, but it should be encouraged instead of discouraged.
Angelika?
I think living in the here and now, this is digital transformation. And with a little bit more the absence of fear, this is a very important issue. And don't give up. So push and go ahead. This is, I think, very important.
Mm-hmm. And for me, well, firstly, leadership is not a rank, it's a choice. And I think the organizations that are going to do very well in the next 5–10 years are the ones that are designing parallel spaces in order to fail better, and learn. How they're going to learn quickly, they will do well. And of course, many leaders in our organizations are not taught how to orchestrate diversity. That's something you have to find it in the field. And the ones that want to go and start experimenting things, because it's about experimenting. We actually, in our group today, we don't talk much about projects anymore because that brings ROIs on things and structures, right? Let's talk about little experiments, which are trial and error, and let's go little by little into something. And also it's about trust. If you as a leader are able to create the conditions for people to believe in themselves, have creative confidence, and have creative courage, because not only is it confidence, it's just go there and you have to mobilize everybody and everything to make your thing go to the market. How are we giving this confidence to people? I think that's an interesting question.
Thank you very much. Give a big hand of applause to this fantastic panel. Thank you.